We buy homes believing they're sanctuaries, places where walls protect us. Neighbors offer comfort, and locks keep the outside world at bay. But what if those walls hide something watching you from the attic? What if a rocking chair you threw out is suddenly waiting for you in the basement? What if the stranger who waves and smiles isn't who they claim to be? These stories remind us that true horror doesn't always come from ghosts or legends. It comes when the safe places we trust most turn against us, and the danger is already inside. The attic stranger. Alex had spent the last 2 years saving up for his first home. He was a single guy, living alone, and while he didn't need a huge place, he'd found a charming 2-story house in a quiet, established neighborhood that felt just right. He'd closed on the house a few days before, and moving day had finally arrived on a Saturday. Alex had roped in a couple of his friends to help unload the rental truck, and they spent the better part of the afternoon carrying boxes inside. He paid them in pizzas and beer, and after the heavy lifting was done, they just hung out for a while. As one of his friends, Dale, came back from using the upstairs bathroom, he casually mentioned something strange. "Hey man," Dale said, "you might have some pipe issues. I was in there and heard some weird thumping and scratching from inside the walls." Alex just shrugged it off, assuming it was the house settling or maybe some old pipes groaning. He made a mental note to check it out later, but it was far from his mind. A couple hours later, his friends left, and Alex was finally alone in his new home. The house was quiet save for the hum of the refrigerator. He spent the rest of the evening unwinding, sitting on the floor of his now half-empty living room, streaming Netflix on his laptop. The clock ticked past midnight, and the house began to feel different. The comforting silence was replaced by a more oppressive stillness. It was then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from the ceiling directly above him. He looked up, a knot forming in his stomach. The sound was distinct. It wasn't the creaking of an old house. It was a measured thump, thump, thump. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, a squirrel or a raccoon in the attic. He got up and walked to the base of the stairs, listening. The sound stopped as soon as he moved. He waited for a moment, and they didn't return. Feeling a bit foolish, he decided to check the attic, just to be sure. The pull-down stairs were in the hallway right outside his bedroom. He grabbed the cord, pulled it down, and a set of wooden stairs unfolded with a groan. The darkness of the small opening above felt heavy, and he found himself taking a deep breath before climbing up. He reached the top and fumbled for the light switch. A single bare bulb flickered on, casting a dim, sickly yellow glow over the space. The attic was mostly empty. He had yet to move any of his storage up there, so it was just the exposed wood beams and some insulation. The air was stale, and dust motes danced in the lone beam of light. He scanned the space, his heart still thumping. There was nothing. No animal, no person. Just a couple of large frame paintings leaning against one of the walls. The thumping sounds were completely gone now, replaced by the low buzz of the light bulb. Convinced he had just been hearing things, or that whatever it was had scurried away, he went back downstairs, pulled the stairs up, and went to bed. He lay in bed for what felt like an eternity, his mind still racing. He was just starting to drift off when the thumping began again. This time it was louder, more deliberate. It was coming from directly above his bed, and it was no longer just thumping. He could hear a faint scratching sound, and something that sounded like muffled dragging. The sound was so close, so insistent, that his earlier theory about a raccoon seemed absurd. He had to know. Alex got out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, and crept back into the hallway. He pulled down the attic stairs for the second time, and the sounds immediately stopped. He held his breath, listening. Nothing. He climbed back up into the musty darkness, a chilling sense of dread washing over him. He walked over to the section of the attic directly above his bedroom. This area was different. The attic didn't extend the entire length of the house, and a temporary wooden wall had been put up, sectioning off the space above his room from the rest of the attic. The sounds, he now realized, had been coming from behind this wall. He approached the wall and put his ear against it, listening intently. There it was again. A low, shuffling sound, followed by a soft, guttural murmur. It was coming from the other side. As he stepped back, his eyes fell on the two large frame paintings leaning against the wall. He remembered seeing them earlier, but now he noticed something off about them. They were slightly angled as if they had just been moved. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed one of the paintings aside. Behind it was a large, jagged hole in the drywall. It wasn't a small hole for pipes. It was big enough for a person to crawl through. Alex felt the blood drain from his face. It took a few moments for his brain to process what he was seeing. A human-sized hole, and he wasn't alone. As the realization sank in, he heard a sound from inside the opening, a low, rattling breath. Before he could react, the painting was suddenly and violently pushed out of his hands. He yelped in shock as it clattered to the floor and a figure scrambled out of the hole. It was a woman, frail and sickly-looking with pale skin and tangled hair. She was swaying, her eyes wide and unfocused, a creepy, high-pitched laugh bubbling from her throat. Her movements were jerky and unnatural. She lurched forward, her nails digging into Alex's shoulder with surprising force. He screamed, adrenaline flooding his system, and shoved her away with everything he had. She stumbled backward, disappearing into the dark opening. Alex didn't hesitate. He scrambled down the stairs, yanked the cord, and shut the attic door with a loud thud. He sprinted to his bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Huddled against the door, his chest heaving, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "There's a person in my house," he choked out. "In the attic. I just moved in. I think she's high or something. She attacked me." The police arrived in what felt like seconds. 3 patrol cars pulled up outside, and a total of 5 officers entered the house. 4 of them went upstairs, their flashlights cutting through the darkness of the hallway. Alex heard them pull down the attic stairs, then a moment of quiet followed by a horrific shriek. It was the woman, screaming like a wild animal. The sounds of a struggle and muffled shouts followed. "Taser! Taser!" one of the officers yelled. The struggle ended with the click of handcuffs. A few moments later, the officers carried the woman out of the attic and past Alex, who was still trembling in his bedroom doorway. Her eyes were still wide, her body limp and unresponsive as they took her outside to one of the patrol cars. When the house was secured, Alex, with an officer accompanying him, went back into the attic. He pushed the painting back and looked into the dark space. It was a small, crudely finished room, just large enough to crouch in. In one corner was a pile of dirty blankets and a stained pillow. Everywhere else were crumpled wrappers, empty bottles, and in another corner, a pile of human waste. The smell was overpowering. It was clear she had been living there for a long time, watching and listening, waiting in the hidden spaces of the house. The police later informed him that the woman was taken to a psychiatric facility. The violation of it all, the thought that someone had been living in his new home, a stranger in the walls, secretly watching and listening to him and his friends, was a feeling he could never shake. That was the first night in his new house, and the memory of what he found in his attic has made it impossible for him to ever feel completely safe inside his own home again. The rocking chair. Mark was 28 when his father helped him buy his first house. He wasn't spoiled, but his dad had money and offered to lend him a large sum to cover the down payment. The house itself was a beautiful 2-story from the 1970s, owned by an elderly couple. The husband had passed away years before, and the wife had died just a few weeks before Mark made his offer. The son, who was handling the estate, kept a lot of the furniture in the house for Mark, which was a huge help. It meant he had less to buy and fewer rooms to worry about furnishing right away. But a lot of the stuff was old and had a creepy, outdated vibe. The day after moving in, Mark decided to do some serious purging. He dragged a bunch of it out to the curb, including an old weathered rocking chair from the living room. It was heavy, and the wood felt greasy to the touch. He wanted nothing to do with it. He spent most of the second day in the house cleaning and unpacking the upstairs, which mostly consisted of heavy lifting and a lot of dust. By the time evening rolled around, he was completely exhausted. Mark had a mild form of insomnia, and he hadn't slept a wink the night before. His body was screaming for a break. He decided to just get some Chinese food for dinner rather than trying to cook in his still chaotic kitchen. When he returned to the house about an hour later, he noticed something was wrong immediately. His brand new front door was unlocked. He was a meticulous person, and the thought of him forgetting to lock the door to his new house felt impossible. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He slowly pushed the door open, the faint smell of his Chinese food filling the silent, dark house. He flicked on the light in the entryway and then in the living room, and then the kitchen, bathing the entire main floor in a bright, comforting light. The more light, the safer he felt. He checked the downstairs bathroom, the closets, and every corner. Nothing. He started to feel a bit foolish, and a wave of relief washed over him. He must have just forgotten. It was an honest mistake. He went upstairs and did the same, flipping on the lights in the common area in all 3 bedrooms. He was about to sit down and eat his food when he remembered the basement. It wasn't a large basement, just a small space for the washer and dryer, but he knew he couldn't relax until he had checked it too. He walked to the basement door, which was right next to the kitchen, and opened it. He reached in and flicked the light switch, and a dim light illuminated the top of the stairs. As he went halfway down, he saw it. Sitting in the middle of the small basement, right by the washer and dryer, was an old rocking chair. Mark froze. He hadn't seen a chair down there when he had done the walkthrough of the house. As he got closer, his mind began to race. It was the same chair. He was sure of it. The same weathered wood, the same strange angles. It was the rocking chair he had hauled out to the curb the night before. He looked around the cramped basement, his flashlight from his phone cutting through the shadows. There was nobody down there. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no other entrances. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe the chair had been in a different room and he had just overlooked it. Maybe he was so tired he was seeing things. After a moment, he decided he was just being paranoid. He turned and headed back up the stairs, leaving the basement door cracked open behind him as he walked into the kitchen. He was just about to open his container of lo mein when a low, rhythmic creaking sound reached his ears. Creak, creak, creak. It was coming from the basement, the sound of a chair rocking. His blood ran cold. He walked back to the basement door, his heart pounding in his ears. He reached for the light switch and flipped it. Nothing happened. He flipped it again. Still nothing. The basement was now completely dark and the rocking sound continued, echoing from the void below. Mark's mind went blank. He just needed to know what was making the noise. He grabbed a flashlight from under the kitchen sink, a heavy-duty one his dad had given him, and crept back to the basement stairs. He descended just a few steps, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the darkness. The rocking sound stopped. The beam landed on the rocking chair, now a dark, silent silhouette in the center of the room. Mark held his breath, his hand shaking. He slowly raised the beam, and that's when he saw her. Sitting in the chair was an old woman. She had frizzy gray hair and glasses and was wearing an old-fashioned pink nightgown. As his flashlight beam settled on her, she slowly, deliberately, turned her head to face him. Her eyes were dark, unblinking voids. Mark gasped, the sound a ragged choke in his throat. He turned and scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut and locking it with a sharp click. He stood in the kitchen, trembling, his mind unable to process what he had just seen. He immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, they searched the entire basement, shining their flashlights into every nook and cranny. There was nothing. No person. No hidden compartments or exits. The rocking chair was still there, but the officers, Mark could tell, were looking at him like he was crazy. They asked a few more questions, then left. Still shaken, Mark remembered the contact information for the son who had sold him the house. He called him around 9 p.m. and, doing his best to keep his voice steady, described the woman he had seen. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The son's voice, when it returned, was thin and choked with tears. You just perfectly described my mother," he said. He asked about the nightgown, and Mark confirmed it was a faded pink one. The son began to cry and said that was her favorite nightgown. He told Mark he'd be right over. The son arrived within the hour. Mark led him downstairs, and the man just stared at the chair, his hands shaking. He was emotional and distraught. After a long conversation, he took the rocking chair with him. He said he just needed to bring it home. That was the first of many unsettling moments in the house. Mark lived there for a year and a half, but he never felt truly at home. He kept the basement door locked 247 and was terrified to do laundry for months. The lingering unease of a silent, unseen presence in the house was a fear he couldn't escape, even when he tried to tell himself it was just a figment of his imagination. He would eventually sell the house and move on, but the memory of what he saw that night and the chair that came back would forever haunt his mind. The neighbor called Gene. When Adam was 12 years old, his family moved to a new house in a rural part of Louisiana. They were used to country living with a preference for open space and quiet. The property was 3 acres and incredibly private, surrounded by dense trees on all sides. It felt like they were the only people for miles. On the second night in the new house, their dog Parker, who slept on a bed in Adam's room, started acting strangely. In the middle of the night, Parker began to bark and growl, a deep, rumbling sound that was far more aggressive than his usual barks. When Adam sat up in bed, Parker's tail wagged, but he continued to growl and stare into the corner of the room. Adam checked the closet, but there was nothing there. He told Parker to be quiet, and the dog eventually settled down. But every now and then, Adam could hear him lift his head off the bed, letting out a low, muffled growl. The next day, an older man came knocking on the front door. Adam's father answered while Adam was watching cartoons in the living room. He could hear the entire interaction. The man introduced himself as Gene, a neighbor from the next property over. The dad told Adam to come over and introduce himself. Gene seemed kooky, even to a 12-year-old. He had a thick southern accent and a slightly unblinking stare that made Adam uncomfortable, but he seemed harmless enough. A few days later, Adam was in the backyard, sitting at a small picnic table and playing Pokemon on his Game Boy. The rest of his family was out, and his dad was in the front of the house mowing the lawn. It was then that Gene just wandered into the yard, wearing overalls and a wide-brimmed farmer's hat. He came right up to the picnic table and sat down, asking what Adam was up to. There was no fence separating the two properties, but the sudden intrusion felt deeply unsettling. Adam told him he was playing Pokemon, and to his surprise, Gene knew what it was. He started making a high-pitched, unsettling imitation of Pikachu's voice, trying to be funny, but just came off as creepy. There was definitely something off about this guy. A few minutes later, Adam's dad came into the backyard with the lawnmower, then turned it off when he saw Gene sitting with his son. He approached them with a smile, but Adam could see a flicker of confusion and annoyance in his eyes. His dad greeted Gene, then told Adam that he needed to go inside and wash the dishes. Adam knew his dad was trying to get him away from the man. After a few minutes, his dad came inside and asked, "Did that guy just walk into our yard?" Adam confirmed it. His dad's tone immediately turned serious. "I don't want you around him anymore. You let me know if you see him again. You understand?" It wasn't until a few nights later that Adam woke up to the sound of Parker growling and barking again. This time, the dog was staring directly at the window. Adam felt the chill run down his spine. He slowly got up, and with a mix of fear and curiosity, he opened the window to listen for a possible animal or person outside. He heard nothing at first, just the quiet sound of crickets. Then, out of the darkness below, he heard it. That same creepy, high-pitched voice he'd heard in the backyard, but this time, it was clear and chilling. "Pikachu!" Adam screamed and ran out of his room, yelling for his dad. He told him that Gene was outside his window. His dad immediately stormed outside to check the property, but there was no one there. Confused and furious, his dad went over to the neighbor's house next door to confront the man. But when an older woman answered the door, she had no idea who Gene was. She lived there for years and had never heard of a man with that name living anywhere nearby. His dad went to every house on the quiet road, but nobody had ever heard of him. The man who had walked into their yard, who had sat at their table, and who had stood outside his son's window at night didn't exist. His dad called the police and filed a report. The authorities said they would be on the lookout for a man matching the description, and the incident even made the local news. The family never saw or heard from Gene again, or whatever his real name was. But Adam never forgot the chilling feeling of realizing that someone, a complete stranger, had lied about who they were just to get close to him, and that for a moment, he had been completely alone with them. The crawl space. Sarah had saved up for years to buy her first home. It was an older place on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy, but it had character. The real selling point was the price. It was a steal. The house had been on the market for a long time, and the realtor told her it was because of the musty smell and some minor foundation issues. Sarah didn't mind. She figured a few renovations would fix everything. She moved in on a sunny Saturday afternoon and spent the first few days unpacking. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. She started noticing small, weird things. The first night, she heard a faint, persistent dripping sound. She checked every faucet in the house, but none were leaking. It seemed to be coming from the wall behind the bathroom, but after a few minutes of listening, it would just stop. A few days later, she noticed her half-and-half creamer was a little bit empty, even though she'd only just opened it. She shrugged it off, assuming she had accidentally used more than she thought. A week into living there, she decided to tackle the musty smell and went into the basement. In one corner, she found an old, unfinished crawl space with a heavy wooden door. It was locked with a small padlock, which the previous owner must have forgotten to mention. She made a mental note to get the key from the realtor. That night, as she was lying in bed, she heard a soft, rhythmic scratching sound coming from behind the wall near her bedroom closet. It was too quiet to be a rat, but too deliberate to be a tree branch. It was just a slow, scraping noise. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she chalked it up to an animal getting into the crawl space. The next morning, the scratching was gone. She went into the basement with the intention of calling a repairman about the crawl space door. But when she got there, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The padlock was gone. The heavy wooden door was ajar by just an inch or two. A wave of dread washed over her. She pushed the door open, her phone's flashlight cutting through the stale, dusty air. The crawl space was small, maybe 5 feet by 6 feet, with a low ceiling. It was empty, but as she swept her flashlight beam across the dirt floor, she saw something that made her hand tremble. A patch of dirt was perfectly smooth, as if someone had just recently been lying there. In the center of the clean patch, a small modern video camera was sitting on the ground aimed directly at the opening. The blood drained from her face as she looked up. On the other side of the crawl space, a small, perfectly round hole had been drilled through the drywall directly into her bedroom. It was a peephole. She didn't hesitate. She ran upstairs and called the police, who arrived within minutes. They found no one, but confirmed the camera and the peephole. They told her that based on the camera's angle, the person was likely watching her sleep. The intruder had probably heard her coming down the stairs and had slipped out through a different exit while she was in the basement. Sarah sold the house a year later. She never saw anyone, and she never found out who it was. But the knowledge that a complete stranger had been watching her, living just a few feet away, was a feeling she could never shake.